Just some quick data here. You guys have heard a lot about this. I think from our economic forecast, this is Alaska, Canada, and other parts of the Arctic. I think the key point here is we've grown at about a 6.4% compounded average growth rate since 2001. That rate, if you extrapolate that out and you look at what's the potentially we have about a $700 billion GDP market in the Arctic. Now, a 6.3% growth rate, and I've shared this with a lot of people, it has been 3 times what the rate of growth in the United States has been, slightly less than China, but we may catch up to them shortly given their current situation. And so very impressive that our particular area has been under the radar, but yet growing at a significant growth rate. From a natural resource perspective, Alaska is and will likely continue to be an oil and gas resource state. We lag behind Canada with regard to mining. And if you look at the amount of mining activity that occurs in Canada, it's a huge multiple over Alaska. That's a couple factors. We own about 2/3 of Alaska is owned by the federal government, which makes permitting access to lands a little more difficult than, say, Canada in their provincial system. So if you look at the amount of resource in the billions of dollars available, it's a significant amount of activity that we can see. With the price of oil coming up a couple bucks today, maybe. But if you look at the most recent data that we have on oil and gas spending and employment in Alaska, it's really we've got a tailwind. Lieutenant Governor Treadwell, Governor Parnell, passed a significant oil tax reform that gave us a somewhat of a tailwind going into this. The voters approved that in a referendum, and the companies have committed significant CapEx, and they continue to spend that CapEx. And so, as an investor, I'm sitting here waiting for the slowdown. Now, I think the slowdown is going to happen, but this tailwind in the price of oil certainly has given us a bit of a buffer and a bubble from where perhaps the rest of the United States or the world is at right now. Our fiscal situation, we have a lot of capital. I'm going to get into this a little bit more in detail further. So, Governor Walker mentioned the Iditarod yesterday, and we were sitting around the office. I got a great staff who loves to do PowerPoints. Yeah, not. We were sitting around the office over the weekend thinking about the PowerPoint. We really came up with an analogy of where we're at. And I just sort of want to delve into this. The race of the Arctic reminds me of the last great race, the Iditarod, a race many call the toughest on Earth. Every spring, we enjoy watching and participating in this event. The drama of the Iditarod is unbelievable. The race is difficult, it's a marathon, and competitors change. The race changes, the snow conditions are different from day to day, week to week, year to year, and it's virtually impossible to pick the winner. We all know that oil was discovered and production started in 1977. The state of Alaska enjoyed the ceremonial start in Anchorage. The weather has generally been good. The trail conditions have been favorable. We had an easy ride to Eagle River. We enjoyed $1 billion surpluses through the early 80s. Every legislative district had their own discretionary capital budget. There was no need for long-term planning. We enjoyed an early restart in Willow. Not Fairbanks, we'll just go with Willow. There were some nervous times in the 90s and the early 2000s. We had a few rough spots when oil dropped below $10 a barrel. Felt like we had hit a trail with no snow. We had to replace our runners and a few times and had to push through to a better trail. We made it past Squintna, headed up the Alaska Range. Our team was well fed and rested. The team up the front side of the Alaska Range has been challenging. The weather has been good, but most importantly, the trail conditions have been very good. Lots of packed snow, easy running for the team. We're now at the top of the range, Alaska Range, and headed down the backside of the range. We have the Dalzell Gorge in front of us, and beyond that, we have the Farewell Burn. We have a lot to consider: foreign competition. Africa has a significant amount of LNG. Other parts of the world have a significant amount of natural gas. Other parts of the world have oil. Local conditions, the weather, the state's budget, the federal budget. But our most important asset is our ability to visualize the rest of the race, to put together a strategy for the race. Almost every Iditarod winner has used a conservative strategy but made decisive moves within that strategy. Rick Swenson riding into the storm in the Bering Sea coast. Some called it crazy, but it was about calculating the strength of his team and making a decision. Our state needs to and develop our strategy for Arctic infrastructure. For 10,000 years, Alaska's first people have adapted, and it's with this adaptation. We've looked around the world for other models to look at in this particular instance, and something that I hear around our Arctic infrastructure is we don't have any money. The state of Alaska is broke. We don't have the assets to be able to invest into Arctic infrastructure. So I took it as a personal challenge. Mead and I actually were in Toronto, Canada, meeting with a very large pension fund. And he told me the story of their entrance into Australia. So we went into Australia, or we went to look at their program in Australia. What Australia has done, which I think is very innovative, is they've put together an asset recycling model. That asset recycling model is really encouraging unlocking the capital on the balance sheets of Australia. How do they do that? They do that to fund new investment in productive infrastructure across the country. This model creates opportunities for investors to invest in quality infrastructure assets around Australia and leverages a significant increase in private sector investment by putting assets previously owned by the government in private hands. This is a radical idea for Alaska, in a state where we've had the government provide ports, roads, industrial roads, all of those infrastructures, FedEx terminals, all those things the state of Alaska has done. Australia's federal government incentivized states and territories to sell assets by subsidizing a portion of the infrastructure project costs. They received a 15% incentive to go out and sell assets. Now, in this scenario up here, approximately $68 billion was raised by the states. Approximately $58 billion in new capital came in from the private sector, and $50 billion was invested by the federal government, for a total investment of $125 billion into new infrastructure in Australia. How does it work? Well, in Australia, how it works is State A decides to privatize Port Thomas under a 99-year lease with an expected net sale proceeds of $1 billion, and to reinvest 100% of these proceeds in additional road investment in the capital city and regional areas. Under the terms, State A receives an additional $150 million from the federal government as an incentive payment to go out and do that transaction. Scenario 2, State B seeks to privatize XYZ Energy Company with an expected net sale proceeds of $5 billion and intends to reinvest 50% of that into new roads and rail. With that, they receive $375 million in an incentive. Very interesting program. This was implemented in 2014. So, what's occurred in Australia is the Asset Recycling Fund has proceeds from privatization, other seed funding sources, and other capital from the federal government into transportation infrastructure, new investments, ports, and other rail projects that unlock their resources within Australia. I'm going to do a radical thought here. Could Alaska do a similar program, and what would that look like? How would that look today? What do we share with Australia? Alaska has expansive landmass, huge landmass. All of you know, and all of you people that live out in rural Alaska. High square miles per capita ratio. Not a lot of people, a lot of land. People don't like to bump into each other too much. We have limited infrastructure, very limited. We did a study as to how much infrastructure we have, and we are infrastructure poor. And we are rich in natural resources. Alaska had $82 billion in net assets in FY14. Alaska's net assets grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 9.7% over the last 5 years. Alaska is rich in natural resources and financial assets, the permanent fund, CBR, statutory budget reserve, but relatively poor in infrastructure. The state of Alaska would need to implement an asset recycling model. It would not be implemented by the federal government or anyone else. Just an example of some of the assets, and I ran into Bill O'Leary on a flight from Fairbanks down to Anchorage last night before Mead's party, and I said, hey, Bill, by the way, FYI, Alaska Railroad's on the auction block. He kind of laughed. He said, no one's going to want to buy it. But some of the assets of the state currently, we've got the Alaska Railroad. The Alaska Energy Authority is sitting on about $1.5 billion almost in assets, which include Bradley Lake, the investment in Susitna-Wantana, and the Alaska Intertie. AHFC has a loan portfolio of about $1.5 billion. And Ada is sitting on a portfolio of about $1.2 billion, which includes the Ketchikan Shipyard, DeLong Mountain Transportation System, Schnedesham Hydroelectric Facility, FedEx Maintenance Facility, and the Skagway Ore Terminal. So we've got assets on our books. This isn't a complete accounting, but this is something we've come up with. So, again, this is the disclaimer that Scott and I did not coordinate presentations. What we're proposing, or what I'm proposing today, is the state potentially look at selling and raising $1.5 billion of net proceeds in cash by selling assets that we can agree on that perhaps could be privatized. Now, the state of Alaska is going to have some tough capital budget years. And years past, we could have walked down to Juneau, talked to the chairman of finance. 1.5 billion, sure, we'll wire the money tomorrow. Maybe not that easy. But there was a time where we had a lot more capital. Today, we do not have that capital. What I would propose is we leverage our $1.5 billion with a 1-to-1 ratio where we go out and raise another $1.5 billion of debt. Okay, that's $3 billion of new capital without asking for $1 from the state legislature or the governor. What I then propose is we enter into a public-private partnership with folks like Scott Minard and the group you've put together, and we leverage it 1 to 2, which means we take our $3 billion that we've raised within the state without going to the legislature and asking for a single dime, and raising an additional $6 billion of private capital. And perhaps it fits very nicely with what Scott presented. So at the end of this, what we have is a $9 billion infrastructure fund created by recycling assets that perhaps we don't necessarily need to hold as a state, where private investors are competing globally to buy these assets, and reinvesting that into a vehicle. I got John Springsteen here, who's the new executive director of Ada, and what I'm proposing is we've got the Arctic Infrastructure Fund, which is an amazing tool that has $0. And I believe that if we partner with Ada, other tools we have, that the state of Alaska can do something bold. We could do something bold in a time of very tight budgets without asking for an additional dollar from our state of Alaska. So, again, to summarize here, $1.5 billion in proceeds from sales, $1.5 billion from debt, which is a 1-to-1 ratio. That brings us to $3 billion, and then leverage that 2 times for a total infrastructure fund of $9 billion. What do we got in the pipeline as far as infrastructure projects? Well, we got pipelines. We've got the Alaska LNG project. We have a proposed pipeline to Donlin Creek. We've got the Chukchi to Trans-Alaska pipeline system that may have to be built. We have hydro projects. We have the Susitna-Wantana project, which we've invested over $200 million into today. That is probably 10 months from a FERC license and is struggling to get to that point. We've got Nome, Port Clarence, Seward, Skagway, Port Mackenzie rail extension, over $600 million in ports and harbors that we can say today could utilize funding. We have a bridge, Kinnick Arm Bridge, that potentially could utilize this. And we have roads, the Ambler Road, Juneau's access improvement, West Susitna access. So from our calculations, $9 billion would go a long way towards getting some of these projects that are that need capital today to get built, and would do really three things. One, for workers, for employees, you'd have more jobs, more job opportunities. Construction companies would be busier. Electricians would be busier. Merchants would be busier. There would be people that would be active in this scenario. It would do two. It would build out rural Alaska, where we have some of the highest energy costs and highest unemployment rates. And then finally, I think that this program potentially could get us in a competitive position globally, so British Columbia or Mozambique or Tanzania or other places in the world develop their resources, and we're sitting here for the next 50 years with a high unemployment rate and not a great economy. I think one project, Susitna-Watana, is starved for cash right now. I believe that this project potentially could be funded entirely by the private sector. I've advocated for this at a couple talks. I think that this project potentially could fit into a very good scenario for this fund. So in closing, how hard do we push for the gold at the halfway prize? Who should we partner with? Are they friendly investment competitors? And will they treat Alaska as a partner? Or will they work to drop us later in the race? Our priority has been the long-term vision, but decisive on a day-to-day basis. Alaska recycling model is a decisive strategy. It needs a lot of work. Certainly this is the first time I've talked about it at a conference this large. But I believe when we sit here and we talk about Arctic infrastructure financing, and the first question is, we're broke, we don't have any money. I don't think that's true. I think it's completely not true. And we just need decisive action to make it happen. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions here shortly.